So, Dr. Rachel Clarke, I'm so happy just to see your face. We met 2020 post the first lockdown, and today is the 4th anniversary of the terrible pandemic. So it feels particularly poignant and important to be having this conversation.
Well, I am delighted to be here, and yes, it is, isn't it? It's hard to believe that a whole 4 years have elapsed. I'm shocked to think of it.
Yeah. So for those that don't know you, and you need to fill in the gaps, is that you were a journalist and a documentary maker, and then late-ish in the day, at 29, you trained to be a doctor, and you're a palliative care doctor, and you work in a hospice and the NHS, and you've written 3 best-selling books, and you are now also a screenwriter to Breathtaking, based on your book that has just been transmitted and was kind of horrifyingly honest and truthful. So thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So that's the kind of context of you, but I guess what I'm also interested in you, and I think where you and I connected at Wells, was the internal world of, and the moving in and out of when it's kind of impacted by the external world. And you're remarkably open and honest about how what you do affects you psychologically and physiologically. And the first question I always ask everybody on this podcast is, what is a particular challenge you have faced or are facing?
So we might as well go straight into the thick of the NHS in my answer, because this is a sort of daily lived challenge at work. And I no longer work in a hospice. I decided after the sort of peak of the pandemic, those really difficult months in 2020 and 2021, when I was primarily back in the hospital, I decided to stay there because palliative care is so desperately needed by so many thousands of people in the UK. And although in a hospice, we have this incredible opportunity to provide absolute gold standard palliative care to a small number of inpatients, actually in our hospitals are so many more patients who are really struggling, and as they approach the end of their life, and they're not necessarily getting the care they need. And so I just felt like I wanted and needed to stay in that environment and work with teams trying to do that. So I'm still working in palliative medicine, but now in a big NHS hospital. And I think the greatest challenge for me at work, and it is literally daily, is the difficulty of being somebody who, like all healthcare professionals, went into my job, medicine, because I wanted to help people. I cared about vulnerable people, and I want to do a good job of helping them at work, but I inhabit a system which makes it incredibly difficult to do that. The pressures were obviously immense during the peak of the pandemic, but they're still pretty immense now. And there's this terrible mismatch between numbers of patients and numbers of staff. It means that I very often will go to work and I may be having a difficult, intensely personal, intimate end of life conversation with a patient who's literally lying on a trolley in a corridor, and we don't even have a cloth curtain to draw around us for privacy. And that's psychologically painful. It causes, I think, all of us a huge amount of anguish, because we know that the care we're providing falls very far short of ideal, and there's nothing we can do about that, or it can feel as though there's very little we can do about that. And I struggle with that, and occasionally when I come home from work and I need to have a good cry at the end of the day, it's often not because I've been involved in a heartbreaking situation because of what the patient is experiencing per se. It's actually the anguish of almost knowing that across the country patients are being failed, and we NHS staff are not able to give them what we know they need because the system isn't working properly. And I find that really difficult sometimes.
I mean, I can just imagine the essence of you is wanting to care for people as they are and meet their needs as they particularly need to be met, and working in a system that hobbles that and sort of stops you being able to be who you are. In some ways, there's this idea of moral injury, but there's much more. It feels to me like a sort of degradation internally, that one kind of gets worn internally by constantly wanting to be able to do something and constantly being hit back. And where you particularly fascinate me is from your work that I've really paid attention to and learned from and been very inspired by, is that you choose the most gritty. So you chose palliative care because it was the sort of Cinderella of medicine. It's not glamorous. You chose now to work solely in the NHS, which is more demanding psychologically because there's more unmet need, but you're wanting to meet the need as best you can. What is it within you where you go for doing the most difficult thing? Where do you think that comes from within you?
I think bizarrely, paradoxically, in a strange way, it is a form of self-protection. And by that, I mean that as I have gone through life and the strange sort of mismatch of careers that I've had, they have gone from the most theoretical and esoteric almost to the most practical. I studied PPE originally at university, philosophy, politics, and economics. But what I loved was philosophy. I liked my learning to be as kind of pure and theoretical as you can get, which is maybe philosophy or mathematics. And then journalism was primarily about words. It was about creating
This narrative, the
something.
story.
Exactly. But I felt quite keenly as a journalist the loss of the kind of lived human interactions with people that I wanted and I felt I needed to be having at work. And then during my time as a medical student and as a doctor, it became increasingly clear to me that that very simple thing, almost the heart of you as a human being, striving to connect with your patient imperfectly, with all your flaws and frailties, but trying to do your best, was very, very, very powerful and perhaps should be cherished and nurtured much, much more than it is in the NHS. It's often not really recognised, I think, as a powerfully important part of healthcare. And so I think I was drawn towards palliative care in part because I could see these were a group of patients who were particularly vulnerable and particularly neglected, were not getting the care they needed. And that sort of chimed with me wanting to help people. But also, I think psychologically, I wanted to be able to go to work and conduct myself in that way with patients to try to connect to them human being to human being, because even though that is hard and it exacts a price and it can cost something of you in those interactions, it is also somehow authentic and deeply fulfilling. The more, in a way, I think you risk of yourself, the more impact perhaps you can have in a healthcare profession, particularly in palliative medicine, when people are experiencing these incredibly personal, intimate, and momentous changes in their life, confronting their own mortality and the effect of that on themselves and all the people they love. If you take a risk and really allow yourself to bear witness to that and be a part of it and almost metaphorically hold that patient's hand, you can do great good. So it's almost a way of neutralizing to some extent the pressures of working in an overburdened NHS. It can feel as though the whole system's falling apart, but if I can look directly at this patient in front of me and focus all my attention and effort and self on this situation and this patient, then maybe in a tiny way, I can do something good in that moment. So it's sort of simultaneously psychologically costly, but also very, very positive. It replenishes me at the same time, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think what I get from you is a sort of paradox of life in a way that, the power of love and the power of death and the art and heart of medicine. It felt like when you are your most intensely yourself as both a doctor and a human being and connecting with someone in this moment when death is very close by, you feel both most alive and rewarded in some way. And rewards a sort of shortcut, but also the act of giving gives you something, but it
Yeah.
costs you. And so the other side of it, and I've had this with work too, is I give my best at work and I go home and I give my kids and my husband or life, the the leftovers. And it's such a difficult path to navigate, isn't it, between what matters and what takes priority and the sort of psychological cost personally.
Yes, very much so. And I think, I feel at this stage we should be inviting my husband and kids to to
To
comment
give
perhaps.
feedback. Yeah.
Yeah, give feedback because of course we everybody gets the balance wrong, and we all know what that's like, juggling the demands of our job with our families, our friends, the people we love. I think what you've just described for me is the central defining paradox of human life, this idea that we're the only creature who knows from the outset that we are going to die, that every single person we love in the world, every single thing we love in this beautiful, gorgeous world is going to slip through our fingers one way or another, whether through ourselves dying or the things that we love dying. And there is no way to sweeten that bitter pill. That is the sort of existential cost of being human. And of course, it terrifies some people. How on earth do you live with that knowledge? Many of us sort of try to live our lives almost in denial of that brutal fact, or we try to project ourselves into the future with a legacy. So I don't know why he's popped into my head, but Elon Musk is sort of striving projectile-like into space to have a legacy that will outlive him. And it seems to me as though that sort of
Duality.
duality, that exquisitely painful compact between love and pain, is something I think to embrace rather than shrink away from. The more we love, the more we expose our hearts to loss and pain and grief, the more we take an enormous risk with our lives, but actually the more we live. And there is an incredibly beautiful quote from Ted Hughes about that, where he writes in a letter about the fact that the only thing that matters is how much we open our hearts, how boldly we're willing to live. And I think he's right. The more we allow ourselves to love this world and sort of make those boundaries
To
between
dare.
us, yeah, to dare and open ourselves up to the world. Yes, the cost of that is exquisite pain, but it's also the exquisite joy of living. And I think I'm very lucky. I have a husband who shares that conviction in a very profound sense. And so although I'm a hopeless sort of wife and mum sometimes because I am a bit wrung out from work, I think we all in my family try hard to focus on the moments that are the gifts. I encounter people on their deathbeds all of the time, and none of them wish they'd worked harder. None of them wish
No.
they'd had more
The
wealth, more
10 wishes of the dying, that
yeah,
that phrase.
exactly. And I think it's very inspiring to have that example daily at work. And it's just something that you have to try and build into your life at home as well. It's all about love, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's really interesting as you're talking, I really feel and can sense the kind of power and confidence you have in the duality of really living life is about facing the reality of life, the reality of love is risky, the reality of we are all mortal, we will all die, and that when we live as if it's life's eternal, we don't fully live. So it's in the knowing the risk that it allows us to open our hearts in that way. The thing I want to try and understand is, it's so courageous of you, and also this kind of focused determination to both tell the story so people know, because you want to change the world, but also do the day-to-day. Well, if you kind of go back in time and go back as far as you can, is there a moment or a person, your dad as a GP, an experience that you think influenced that? Because often what we most want to give others is what we most need ourselves.
It's very interesting. Even as a young child, so when I was at junior school, I was definitely a little bit odd in the sense that I felt I had an incredibly overdeveloped, keen sense of injustice, and also a determination to sort of voice that and stand up for.
Which you had all along. Did that come, do you think you were born with that?
Well, I mean, an example of this is in my junior school, the boys and girls were split into gendered tasks. So the boys were allowed to sweep up the dinner hall, sweep up the crumbs at the end of lunch, which was a very easy job, whereas the girls had to wash up all of the teachers' horrible, rancid
Gross,
cheese
greasy
sauce
dishes.
pots.
Yeah.
And I just thought this was absolutely outrageous. I didn't know what misogyny was, but it was definitely wrong. All the other girls thought it was wrong, but I decided one day that it was so unacceptable I would go and speak to the headmistress, and I interrupted their lunch and knocked on the staff room door and said, "This is not fair. You are making the girls do a horrible job and the boys do a nice job, and I think you should change it." And the school did change it.
Wow.
So they made the jobs gender neutral, and I got bullied for quite some time by the
By the
boys.
boys.
They particularly loathed the congealed cheese sauce. But all I felt at that time was just, this is injustice and it needs to be corrected. And I was probably 8 or 9 years old at that time. And I don't know where it came from. It feels as though I was born with it, and I just don't know if it
Could be.
arose from circumstances of early childhood or not. But I think it's definitely a little bit abnormal. And I think to some extent, even today, I have exactly the same sort of slightly black and white view of things, where something will strike me that where the injustice of it feels so wrong that I feel compelled to do something about it. For example, seeing my colleagues at work not having the right PPE when they were stepping up and risking their lives in a pandemic was just utterly wrong. And I had to use whatever means I could to speak out about that, because it was so clearly something that needed to be addressed. And all I can say is I've felt like that to quite an unusual degree from a young age. And I don't know why.
And I imagine there must be times where you feel the injustice and there's a part of you that goes, oh God, do I have to do this again? Because it's a demanding, being the one that puts your head above the parapet, that names the injustice, that fights for it, that pisses people off, like the boys when you were 8, or the government, or journalists, or people who have a different opinion than you, is exhausting. But I was also sort of thinking, it feels like the cost of not fighting is greater for you than the cost of fighting.
100%. For me, hope is a doing word. It's not a state of mind that you aspire towards and believe that maybe you'll be blessed with if you just wait long enough. Hope stems from
Is a plan
action.
A and a plan B.
Exactly. And it's a little bit like love. Love is a doing word. Love, I don't think it's a feeling. I think it's a verb. I think we feel love as we express it through our actions, the conversations we have with the people we love, the loving acts towards them. And so it is with hope. If you don't do anything at all, then the hopelessness is self-perpetuating. If you sort of go to work and you feel overwhelmed by how difficult conditions are and that you are completely powerless to change them, then by definition, that's what will happen. But if you go to work hoping that today you are going to make a difference to somebody, it might be a colleague to whom you give positive feedback and you're the first person who's given them positive feedback for as long as they can remember, or it's a patient where you form a connection with them. If you aspire to making things better, then that's where the hope comes from. It's working towards that. And I know that
So it's a
when I
practice as
do
well as an intention, isn't it?
exactly. It's a verb, it's a practice, and it's work. It is work, but
It is work.
through the work, through the action, that's how you feel hopeful. And I think for me, the alternative is just an unbearable amount of stress. So I'd rather be worn out and trying to do something, no matter how small, than eaten up with stress and anxiety that's stemming from the circumstances that we all wish might be different.
Yeah, I can really see that. And as you were talking, I was also wondering about translating breathtaking into a screenplay and then seeing it on the television and what that experience was for you. Because I remember you being really seriously traumatized when I saw you. And so I'm interested psychologically, the kind of challenge of being traumatized and then writing a book and then doing the screenplay. And did that re-traumatize you? Was it, tell me about the challenge of that in a way.
Well, I think writing that book is testament to just how distorted and messed up conditions were. And I think so many people in the NHS were having such a horrible time with stress, insomnia, trauma, that
The
we all,
chaos.
yeah, chaos. Again, perhaps the writing was a way, it was an action for me that
Yeah,
sort of
a
was an
narrative.
attempt to have some kind of control over the chaos. I think with the drama, it was slightly different. Obviously, the pandemic it's not over. According to the World Health Organization, we are still in a pandemic, but that
The
awful
crisis.
chaotic
Yeah.
period, the crisis is over. And when I came to writing the screenplays, it really was a case of returning and looking very, very closely at a very painful, traumatic time. And I cried at times writing the scripts.
Yeah.
I had to imagine characters and scenarios and events, all of which were
Based on a truth, but
yes, to an incredibly accurate degree. So everything you see on screen has happened in some shape or form. But actually spending time creating and constructing these vividly truthful scenarios did feel
searing.
masochistic at times.
Yeah.
And then going on set, I mean, the first time I walked onto the set, which the production crew had just spent an astonishing amount of time making utterly
Identical.
identical. It was like walking back into the pandemic. And I actually
Gosh.
felt physically my
Palpitations.
heart
Yeah.
racing
Yeah.
because it was like being back there again. And I was sort of, on the one hand, astonished by that and moved that they had
Yeah.
created something so wonderful. But mainly, I couldn't help myself. It felt like being back there. And the whole process then of editing it, which is very laborious and time consuming, every time we analysed and looked at these scenes over and over again,
You
I would,
relived them.
yeah, and I would cry sometimes watching them. And it's not that I wanted to experience any of that, but I desperately wanted to make something that colleagues, NHS members of staff would look at and say, that's me. That's my experience. I feel seen and heard, and I feel as though my story is being shown to the public.
The
And maybe,
validation of that.
yes. And I almost wanted to do that. Every time I felt upset, it almost proved to me why it was important to try and do
Yeah.
this, because everybody's upset. I talk to anyone about COVID, and most people will start to cry within a minute
Yeah.
or two.
Yeah. So there is something, I mean, the words are clumsy, but I don't think curative, but in some ways finding your path through the chaotic kind of horror of what you were part of and witnessed gave you then a kind of sense of agency over that story. It was also the writing of it, I think, is a way of processing the trauma, because there is narrative writing trauma. And then in some way, there's this idea of post-traumatic growth, which this doesn't sound exactly, but I think there's something about, like you say, when the extent of the loss you feel is the extent of the love that you feel. In some way, when you made the screenplay, there was a power in it that you made a third entity. There was your experience as the doctor, there was the NHS experience, and then this third entity, the TV series, spoke for all the unspoken hundreds of thousands of voices, both patients, families, and professionals, to tell them this was your experience. This is your truth. And I'm wanting that to be acknowledged, validated, known, and for how the devastation of it to be experienced physiologically by everyone who watches this.
Yes, absolutely, Julia. And I think as one of the things that was most painful for staff, particularly at the start of the pandemic, but actually all the way through those first 18 months, this terrible experience of what you were living and breathing and witnessing with your own eyes in the hospitals, being denied on the public stage. So a politician standing up and looking the population in the eye and saying there are no national problems with PPE, when you knew that your pitiful paper mask, if you even had one, was not even coming close to the job of protecting you from COVID, or knowing that you had nurses, porters in intensive care, intubated and connected to ventilators, and dying of a disease that they had caught in the hospital because of lack of PPE, and because there were no tests, and because it was chaos, and because no one knew what they were doing. And at the time,
craziness of that, the kind of
yeah,
living your experience and knowledge and reality set against the presentational one, the political presentational one. There's
yes,
a kind of screaming, I imagine, that was in your body that in some way found an actual voice rather than just an outraged, furious scream on the edge of a mountain.
yes, very much so. And it's one thing to be frightened of the virus, and we were all frightened of the virus, of
So
course.
unknown, yeah.
But it's so much more frightening to have all those hard facts about how vulnerable staff were being denied. That really makes you feel scared, because you actually know that at the hands of the sort of powers and structures above you, you are clearly expendable. You are clearly cannon fodder, because instead of being honest and at least having the decency to say, we don't really have a PP stockpile, sorry, we don't have what you need, you'll have to make do with second best. Ironically, we probably all would have said, okay, we will, because we'll help.
We'll deal with it, yeah.
Yeah, but to have that denied, it makes you feel utterly expendable. And I think there's the
And
drama,
adds to your powerlessness, because you kind of think,
yes.
we are so not on the same page and you're paying my wages.
Yeah, you're standing, in fact, on the steps of number 10, clapping and saying, oh, what NHS heroes you are, while knowing that NHS staff have got rubbish PPE and they're dying because of it. And I think after that experience, my desire to put all of that on something as powerful as a television screen, so beaming our lived experience into people's living rooms and just presenting it to the public and saying, you've heard so many things about COVID. You've even heard those people who say it's not a real disease, it's a scamdemic, the anti-vaxxers, all of the misinformation. Here, as authentically as possible, is what we experienced. Please watch it. Please don't look away. Please know that this is what it was like. It felt so important to do that on behalf of everybody who was silenced and powerless and scared and being made to feel as though they were cannon fodder.
So now that it is out and it has been seen by millions, how does that feel? Does that change something? Does that release something in you personally, psychologically?
I think the reaction, the public reaction has, and the reaction from staff has, for me, been one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life. I mean, I was so anxious before the
Of
series came
course.
out. I was
Yeah.
so worried about
That's so
whether,
risky.
yeah, had we done a good job? Had we got it right? Would it connect with staff? Would people, would anyone want to watch it? And so many people, staff and members of the public, said, I'm not sure I can. Or they might say, I definitely can't. It's too painful for
Too
me.
close to my reality.
Yeah. But so many people did watch it and did find it hard to watch, but said, thank you for making this, because now I feel as though I really understand what it was like. I had no idea what you were actually going through. Or staff, and literally thousands of staff have posted messages or contacted me
So
saying,
moving.
this is it. Yeah, this is it. And they've shared their own experiences, and they've been so grateful that their story, they feel, is there on screen. And I think that is just, that's everything I dreamed of trying to achieve with the series, and it
Well
means a
done.
great deal.
Well done. It's an enormous achievement. And so now I'm kind of thinking of, these mountains you've climbed since I saw you 4 years ago, of working in the pandemic, writing Dear Life, and before that, Junior Doctor, and then Breathtaking, and doing the screenplay and the battle within the NHS. What have you learned that will support you so that you can perhaps feel in some way, because it often feels like you of not being enough, that you kind of let yourself know how enough you are. Does that make sense? Maybe it doesn't fit for you.
No, I think I know what you mean. It's so strange, Julian, as the older you get, or the older I get, almost the smaller my ambitions and aspirations are. So, just as an example, after, so the whole sort of breathtaking television experience was very overwhelming, huge. Doing these sort of press days in hotels in London and things, that all this stuff that on paper is very glamorous, but actually is just
It's
very
exhausting.
overwhelming.
Yeah.
But now I'm part-time, but I work long days in the hospital, and they're very intense. And we often have incredibly complex situations with patients. The absolute kind of wholesome quotidian joy of driving to work and just immersing myself in the work that I do with my team. And we're a small, fantastic team with an incredible head of department who sort of leads by example, best possible kind of leader. And we kind of go to work and sort of metaphorically roll up our
With hope.
sleeves with hope. And sometimes, last week, a patient arrived in the resus section of the emergency department, so incredibly unwell and probably in their last hours or short days of life, and they desperately didn't want to die in hospital. And about 4 different teams in the hospital moved heaven and earth to get this patient
Wow.
home where they wanted to be,
Yes.
so that they could die at home with their family around them. And I
Wow.
I sort of wanted to punch the air when I literally saw the paramedics taking this patient away. And that's a small achievement, but actually one that has immense repercussions for that family. And I think the more years I practice as a doctor, the more I cherish those moments. And you have them every day at work. And I try to teach medical students, colleagues, how powerful those moments to be. I try to savor them because they are small, but they mean something. They are immense as well as small. And so, in an odd way, I don't have a kind of impetus to sort of leap ahead and try and address the next challenge. It's not that I'm sort of unsatisfied and always yearning for the next thing. It's just that these things keep cropping up where I feel I have to do something, I have to try. And that's
Yeah.
all, yeah.
It's who you are. The stats about dying at home, where 2/3 of the population want to die at home and 1/5 actually do. And your message, which is so powerful, and I've recorded 2 podcasts recently with people whose husbands died who did not have the type of care you're talking about at all. That kind of world of difference where you see a human being and that attached to that human being are people that love them, and that the memory of their death will live forever in everyone that loves that person. And so when you can give them the death that they have the right and the dignity and the respect to be given, that administration shouldn't block, but often does, of being at home where he was safe in his bed, safe in his body, surrounded by people that loved him, does change Wales.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a national scandal that the NHS does not fund the majority of palliative care, not even close. Between a quarter and a third of palliative care in the UK is funded by the government, the NHS, and the rest is funded by charity. And that is a disgrace. It is staggering. The NHS is meant to be cradle to grave, and yet the grave bit is neglected and ignored. And so many people experience an ending of their life that is so very different to how they would like it to be. And so many families have to endure that. And I will never stop speaking out about that, because I know that the British people are decent. We are decent. We saw that in COVID when the pandemic began, the outpouring of decency and determination and desire to help each other, help vulnerable people, was extraordinary thing. Grassroots kindness, 1 million people volunteering in 2 days to help the NHS. We are decent. And the only reason this state of affairs, where people have an end of life that is so far removed from what it should be, with the love and dignity and comfort around a patient. The only reason we have that, I think, is because it happens almost behind closed doors, the doors of the home or the hospital. It's out of sight, out of mind, and death is a bit of a taboo subject still. People don't want to think about it, but we should think about it, because one day this is all of us. It is all of us. And surely a population that is as decent and compassionate as I know the vast majority of us are, surely we should want to provide our most vulnerable members of society with a civilized and dignified death, ending of their life. We are definitely rich enough to be able to afford to ensure people have that. It's terrible if that doesn't happen.
And to get to you kind of personally towards the end, I imagine your own relationship with your own mortality is a changing relationship, because it gets shaped every day by your experience, but also as someone who does kind of face the reality and nettle of life. And you've been ill, you've had your own kind of threats, as it were, seeing your dad die. How is your relationship with your mortality?
So when I became, I think, really a medical student, and I started to meet patients who were receiving diagnoses of a terminal illness, or were approaching the end of their life, or were even dying before my eyes, and I would have been in my early 30s then. One of the things I learned very quickly was the fact that you were immensely lucky if you had lived long enough to acquire all the trappings of old age that none of us particularly
So
want.
you want.
I'm speaking as a 51-year-old woman who's got plenty of wrinkles and, is most definitely not the kind of svelte, athletic person of my youth. The grey hairs, all of that. All of those things I genuinely believe, and have now for a long time, are a privilege, gifts. You are so lucky to have every single one of them. And when my friends moan about their grey hair and wrinkles, they get very short shrift from me, because I sometimes care for people who are 20, who are dying, or teenagers. When my dad died, I think I learned something very powerful about living that I had not quite yet learned, even while being a palliative care doctor. And that was something about the astonishingly piercing pain of grief. I saw that on the faces of patients and their families at work in a hospice, but I hadn't yet experienced it myself because for
physically
me,
yourself.
yeah, Dad was the first person and is still by far and away the person I have loved most dearly in life who died. And I couldn't believe how ill equipped I was as a palliative care doctor to cope with that. Nothing about medicine prepared me for how staggeringly sort of full body.
Flawed you were.
Oh, yes. This sort of this pain where you almost, I'd be lying on the floor crying, feeling as though I couldn't survive it. It was going to kill
To
me. It was too
break you.
painful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing to love that much.
Yes, exactly. And I think that has helped me again feel at ease with my mortality in the sense that already and for a long time now in my life, I feel mind-blowingly blessed to have loved as much as I have loved, to have the relationships I have. And my father modeled, in a way, the most beautiful approach to the end of one's life. I asked him if he regretted anything once a few days before he died. And he thought about it for a long time. And then he said, no, I don't. I have had a career where I've helped people and I have been fulfilled and I've loved it. And I have my family and I have my wife, my children, my grandchildren. And the only thing I will regret is that I won't see my grandchildren grow up. And I thought about that so much afterwards and thought, my goodness me, isn't that a statement from a man who's lived a good life? How
Yeah.
lucky to reach the end of your life feeling like that. So I think I'm very at ease with my mortality now. I think I've sort of completely built it into the way I live my life in the sense that I try and create as much of those good, precious, wonderful things that we all know.
The now
The
moments, like
now
in the Albert
moments.
Hall with your
Yeah.
dad. So for people listening who may have a family member who's dying, or they may be dying, or kind of you wanting to say what the message is you want people to most know, what would that be coming from your heart?
So I'm really speaking personally now. There is so much to be scared of in life. I spent really the first 3 decades of my life incredibly scared of so many things, huge dose of imposter syndrome, terrified of doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, not being clever enough, not being a good enough doctor, a good enough journalist, just falling short. It was so corrosive, that fear of not being good enough. And it took a long, long time and a year of CBT, cognitive
Oh,
behavioral
well
therapy,
done.
for me to address that. And I don't regret that now. I think all of that helps you grow, you develop as a person. But I think if you are confronting the end of your life or you are facing losing someone you love dearly, I would say from the bottom of my heart, this is the one time to throw all that stuff in the bin, dump all that stuff in the bin and just say, sod it. No fears. I'm going to say what I need to say and want to say to the people around me. And I might say it hopelessly and I might be clumsy and I might get it wrong, but no one cares about eloquence in these situations. What they
No.
care about is sincerity.
And the connection, the depth of connection.
Exactly. Connect with the people you love. Tell them that you're scared. Ask them if they're scared. Fumble through it as clumsily as possible, but reach out honestly and sincerely and just bin the fears and have a go. Then you'll receive something back. I absolutely believe that's very precious from the people around you. That's it. It's the Ted Hughes thing. Be bold, be brave.
That is a beautiful way to end. And I think the fear is often this fear of we'll make a fool of ourselves or not do it right. And I think when you're saying be bold and be brave and dump the fear, is saying just allow yourself to be your full self with all of its fault lines and frailties, but also great gifts and capacity to love and have joy and connect and be fully yourself with another is the greatest gift we can give each other.
It is absolutely the greatest gift. And I see that over and over again with patients who are dying. Everything falls away, only the important stuff remains. And it really is about being honest, sincere, brave, and loving. And it doesn't matter how clumsy and clunky and awkward you are, everybody knows when someone's being sincere, and being ourselves is the only way to be.
And it gives the people around you that memory that then lives on forever, like you with your dad, that he is the most significant person, that you felt the most pain, but also he's in you and part of you and shaping you and obviously influencing how you face your own death. So
Yes.
they sound similar.
And just one tiny reflection on that, because I think it beautifully illustrates this. Very close to my father's death, there was a moment when I was lying next to him. He was in bed, and suddenly I was overwhelmed with tears, and I just started crying like a child because
Sobbing, yeah.
I was sobbing because I knew he was in his last days of life. And I was apologizing. I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. I'm crying. And he kind of held me as he held me as a child. And of course, it's making me almost cry now. And he said, "It's okay, Rachel. I love you. I love you. It's okay." And then he put his hand on my chest and said, "I won't be gone, Rachel. I will be here." And he thumped my heart with his hand. And I sort of felt simultaneously ashamed because I was meant to be caring for him, but I was crying like a child, but also grateful because it was as though it was the last time in his life he was a dad to me, a true dad. I was a helpless child, he was a dad. And then afterwards, I thought to myself, actually, I didn't do something terribly selfish by crying. I gave him an opportunity to be a dad, a father figure again to his daughter who couldn't bear losing a man she loved so much. So I actually think I gave him something precious. And all of that at the time felt like a shameful thing, but it was a beautiful thing. And that seems to me to be an illustration of being frail and human and scared and vulnerable, but being honest, and that trumping everything else, that being the
Yeah.
thing that we were left with.
What a beautiful way to end, Rachel. Thank you so much. Your wisdom and insight and capacity to make what's often incredibly unclear and difficult and complicated, in some ways very clear, is a powerful gift. And I thank you for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Julia. And I've just observed our Labrador puppy moving into this conversation in the background as well. I don't think
Yes.
anyone watching will have spotted that, but she has now
Oh,
lain down behind me on the sofa.
and if there's one thing to comfort one is a Labrador puppy, oh my goodness.
Absolutely.
Hello, Sophie and Emily. So, having had two recordings of families whose partners have died within the NHS, I thought it was particularly interesting recording the episode with Rachel Clarke, a palliative care doctor, and particularly after her television showing of breathtaking. And I wondered what sort of insights came up for you. I mean, so much came up for me about wounded healers, all of these, why we do these jobs.
Yeah, I think it brought up a lot for me too. And one of the things it made me think is I listened to this really wonderful podcast by Malcolm Gladwell, where he interviews a Jesuit priest and professor. His name's Jim Keenan. And he talks about sin as the failure to bother to love.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is such a beautiful way of framing it, and that sin is not people who are struggling like with addiction or behaviors, because actually those people are trying and struggling, but it's more indifference. So like the example of the
Wow.
Good Samaritan, so that people just walk past the beaten man and go to the other side of the road. They didn't inflict the injury, but they didn't help either. They chose to look the other way. And so it's like this thing of indifference, of not bothering to care. And what was so abundantly clear and powerful in Rachel's message was her drive to do the opposite of that, and how much that contrasted, how much that cost her, but also how much that contrasted with her, the government attitude, the government stance. And I think to insist on making a difference is really, really inspirational. I loved how she gave the sort of micro examples of making a difference, that person could go home to die, but also on this kind of macro level, like standing up to institutions, making this documentary, being the voice for lots of people who don't necessarily have a voice. And that to me just was incredibly inspirational to listen to.
Incredible. Such a force.
One of the things that I suppose resonated with me when she was speaking was this kind of how powerless you can feel against the system. And one way of trying to, when you have this part of you that really, and I guess I'm saying what I do is work is very, very different on a different scale and achievement than Rachel, but I really relate to that when I zoom out in my emotions and my mind to the whole system, it feels pointless and overwhelming, and and sort of shut down. And the way to manage some of the pain while still wanting to stay open in your heart is in this sort of one-to-one or interaction where you have some agency. So that, when she was talking about of like the cascade of benefit from having those positive interactions at the point of death or at getting a terminal diagnosis, it has this, positive or negative cascade. And in that sense, you can feel that you do have agency in the world to do good, to stay open, then get sort of shut down by the misery, which I think can happen quite easily.
And I think in some ways you're both taking different stems of the same thing, of like daring to have the courage not to be indifferent and to let yourself, there's that wonderful Jewish expression, you save one life, you save the world. And that's all that we can do. I also want to understand, what is it in some of us that we can dare to do that and have the courage? And what is it in others that we turn away?
One of the things that struck me was that she seems to have, which I know I often lack, is a real belief of self-efficacy, that she can make a difference if she pushes hard. And when she took back to that childhood experience of when what did she do in the school? The jobs for the boys and the girls.
Girls and boys, yeah.
Yeah. And those things can be really powerful as a child, I think, when you experience your own power to make change happen. Like, I'm sure it wasn't all dreamy. It sounds like she was bullied and it was pretty tough. But you can make change. You have the power to do that.
Yes. And I think that the flip side can also be true, that if your experience has been that what you do doesn't make a difference, then you give up. And that can start as early as infancy, right? That, like, say you are a little baby and you are trying really, really hard to get your mum's attention or your caregiver's attention, but for whatever reason you're not able to do that. You actually internalize from a very young age, like what I do doesn't get me the reaction that I want. And that actually can be internalized in a totally subconscious, non-verbal way from really, really young. And it can kind of set a sort of, not a inevitable, but it can set a kind of template of how you view the world. The other thing that I thought a lot about when she was talking is the pandemic, and how the pandemic is unique in that it was universal and yet it was also completely different for each person. And you can't sort of bring it up without sort of a bit like a birth story. You bring it up and everybody wants to tell their version of what that experience was. And I've just been reading a really brilliant book that actually Sophie recommended me, called In Memoriam, and it was set during the First World War. And actually listening to Rachel, it made me think of that her experience of the front line was such a contrast of somebody who was not on the front line, that being stuck in your house, and that many, many people experienced horrendous pain and loss and trauma, but in a really, really different way. And so it's sort of like this universal experience that's also completely individual. And so it's sort of, it can connect you, but it doesn't connect to at the same time. And obviously that was part of the idea of her drama, but I think there aren't many things that are sort of so universal and so individual
Global.
at the same time. Yeah,
and everybody was touched by it.
Exactly.
I think the other similarity, that when you're in this kind of complete survival situation where you are just trying to get through the hour or the day, then the processing nearly always has to come after, for everybody. And obviously the more extreme the situation, the more processing required. And in that sense, breathtaking feels like that's part of the processing, right? Of everyone to make sense of, or people to make sense of what just happened and try and integrate the different stories within society to make sense of what we all just went through communally when we all had very different experiences. Because you can't really tell the story in the moment, because firstly, no one knows what's about to happen. But also everyone's in such a state of fear and survival.
And also, if you look at, say, the Second World War and the Holocaust survivors, so that's the most sort of extreme end of it, most of those stories didn't even, the personal stories, narratives, I mean, there was Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, but the majority of the narratives came out 50 years later, when people were in their 70s, 80s and 90s, and are still coming out now. Because in some ways, in order to survive, and the trauma is so great, they couldn't be faced. And so it's so interesting, the sort of time trajectory on trauma, isn't it? It can take decades. It can live in someone for the rest of their lives.
The time trajectory of trauma, and also you touched on in an interview, Mum, the power of creating that narrative that she did through writing the book, through creating this drama, and that actually, obviously, that's a really, most people aren't going to write a book and create a drama, but you can create a narrative. That doesn't mean that you can't create your own narrative, that you can write things down, you can have conversations, you can connect the dots. You don't need to write a screenplay to be able to make your own narrative.
You can draw images, you can do a mood board, you can cut things out, stick them on paper, you can do a scrapbook, you can get representations of your internal world expressed and then find a narrative through that, can't you?
They do. This is a slight tangent, but where I am in Bath, at the RUH hospital, have this thing, it's called birth journeys or something like that. And what it is that if you give birth at RUH, any time within the next, it's years, it's not months, it's years, you can go back to the RUH and go through your birth, through all the notes and through all the documentations, and they have a trained professional who go through it with you. And I think it's a really beautiful example of how you can try and integrate the narrative, because I think birth for many people, I know this is not what Rachel's talking about at all.
No, but it's totally relative.
It is incredibly traumatic, and what trauma does is also fragment. So you become unsure of what actually happened, what was the reality, what was my experience, and that's very, very frightening. And so you can go and you kind of you have the sort of documented notes from the doctors, from the nurses, of what actually happened in the moment. And I know some people who have done it, and it's been incredibly healing to be able to kind of put those fragmented pieces together for that experience.
That's such a lovely idea. What a somebody creative in the NHS doing a wonderful project.
I think the other thing that was really interesting that she touched in on at the end was about when her father died. It's a question that comes up in therapy in a way quite a bit, is how much can you empathise with someone else's experience when you haven't lived it yourself? And obviously, if you're a therapist, you take the view that hopefully a lot, but there's also something different about when you live something, and I listened to another podcast a while ago that was about a doctor who sort of campaigned in the US about letting people die rather than trying to sustain their life. But then when the podcast was then him, when his dad got sick and was dying, he literally pulled every contact he possibly could to keep his dad alive for as long as he possibly could, even though he'd been TED talking, lecturing. This was him on the talk saying then when I was in it, I just couldn't do it, even though this is what I researched and wrote about and taught on. And in the end, it was his dad who had to be gotta stop. I'm going to die. I'm going to die.
Let me die.
Let me die. And because it's such a concrete difference sometimes between living it and then feeling it in others.
Yes, I think it does. I guess as a therapist, that question of if you haven't experienced it, can you understand it and empathize it? But I also think there's a risk as a therapist, if you have experienced it, of assuming that somebody else's experience is the same as your experience. And the reality is it never is. There might be similarities to it. And, like for me, I worked with children before I had children. And then I had children and I carried on working with children. And I think what flipped for me was the parent part, actually. The working with parents, I think it deepened my my compassion for parents, which I hope I had before, but I think I had it in a different, deeper way after I had children and was a parent. Although hopefully I had compassion. I mean, I definitely felt
sure
it. Hopefully it translated. And I just thought that bit at the end where she talked about her dad dying was just so beautiful. Sort of that bit about allowing him to be a dad just before he died, like that really made me cry. Like as a mother, it made me cry. As a daughter, it made me cry. That she gave that to him. She gave that gift to him in his last moments.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening. And I'm sure this is a podcast that will be relevant to people that you know, because we're all connected to dying and to the NHS. So do please share it. Do help people find us by rating and subscribing. But mainly, thank you for listening. We are so thrilled that you're listening and part of Therapy Works family, and just want to really appreciate you. And thank you also, obviously, Dr. Rachel Clarke, for being such a wonderful guest.